being able to show the world that this is just normal. This is just how we are. We don't have to hide it. We don't have to explain it. It's just who we are. As a fantasy writer, you craft the world you want to live in. That's the world I want.
Greetings and welcome to the Creative Writing Wizard podcast, where we chat with published authors and writers to learn more about them and their books and their process. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate that. I've been a big fan of what you've been doing and excited to be here.
Indeed. And so, for those listening in, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm E. Scott Clevenger, one half of Sainan Books. My co-author Grayson Black and I have been working towards putting this together for. We've been actively working since 2019. We've known each other for 26 years now, so I think it's always been one of those creative mindsets that's been in the back burner, but really putting the last 5 years or so of it together. Our debut novel, War of Night, um, we got that out November of last year. Got a fun new second edition recently off the presses in February. But we've been, we're fantasy authors, been big fans of fantasy and science fiction all of our lives, and really just excited to kind of climb the mountain that is authorship and get our story out in the world.
Indeed, indeed. Yeah, and it's actually kind of funny. As I've said to previous authors that I've interviewed in the past, I tend to go into these books fairly blind. I didn't actually realize it was co-authored until I think it was a week or two ago when you mentioned, oh, by the way, there's a co-author in this. That's awesome. Totally unplanned because we had like a co-author not that long ago as well. Can you talk a little bit about how you found it working as a co-author? Have you worked as I guess a solo author before, or has it been mainly working with your co-author Grayson?
So, ironically, I was never going to be an author. It was a situation where I think kind of walking through the process, like I remember I got very into Stephen King when I was like 9 or 10, way earlier than you should ever rightfully be into Stephen King. Um, but I remember writing Castle Rock and saying that he inspired me to pursue being an author. And I remember getting a letter back from his agent, and it was very encouraging. And then that dream just kind of died. And I took a couple of creative writing courses through, high school and college, but I never just got any traction. And I would write stuff, and people would just tell me, it's not that great. It's not good." Um, and so I knew I had stories. I've been a DM for, Dungeons and Dragons, and I've wrote campaigns, and I've, had a lot of these ideas in my head. And I've had the story for Simon and his father since probably 2004. That was when that first really started to take shape in my mind, but I could never physically get it to words. And my friend was, Grayson. He's been an author for a while. He's done a lot of independent pieces and fanfic and that type of stuff over the years. And he was just looking for a project that he could sink his teeth into. And he had a shadow of an idea. So he had this idea of a street thief who was trying to look for a way out of his life, and then would kind of rise up from those ashes and fall in love along the way, and explore this freedom that they would have, especially in a queer normative world, because it was a gay main character. Um, and he had that idea of what that happened, and his kind of backdrop was what would happen if the shadow realm invaded the land of the undead, and what if your kingdom was the one that was caught in between. And I had this idea of a young kid who's finding that his parents were deeper into a war between the undead and the shadow, and our worlds kind of converged along that idea. And I said, okay, here's everything I have on my notes and what I could do with where I was. I will give it to you if you can formulate it into your story." And he was like, "Great." And so he started to do that, and then he would ask me, "Oh, would you kinda give me an idea for what you want them to say in this scene?" And I was like, "Oh, yeah," and I'd write a little dialogue, and he's like, "Oh, you tend to switch tense back and forth. That's why it seems choppy. Watch this video." And he basically taught me to be an author,
Hmm.
and before I know it, I'm writing half the book, and now our seams are, I'm writing this part, he's writing that part, and we're just kinda zippering it together, and I look at that process and say, like, I could have never gotten here on my own, and now I've gotten these skills, and now I've got an idea for a second series of my solo, which is revolving around dragons in a completely different world setting. But he's now kind of my best protege when it comes to being able to spitball all those ideas and bounce them off the wall. So, yeah, it wasn't working really with a co-author. It was basically growing into an author under this like shared vision that we had.
Hmm. That's awesome. And how does it feel now? So like you had, this inspiration, a good deal of time ago. Um, but then as you say, that dream kind of died. How does it feel now that you've gotten to the point where there is a book out, it's pun published, people have been reading it. You've made it to that point that you had originally, years ago. How does it feel now to have that book out in the world?
It's I would say, I basically on a ranking of events, my marriage to my wife, the birth of my children, the publication of this book. It's I got a text message or a DM from a reader who basically she was giving me a play by play, chapter by chapter as she went through the book and what those moments meant to her and watching somebody experience that joy of that story is it's an almost indescribable feeling because that was just m vague images in your head, two decades ago, and, a lot of the relationship between, Simon and his father, Kern, in the book are based off of the relationship that I had with my father, so being able to kind of invoke some of those, emotions, it's really a cathartic feeling, and knowing that you have that out there. Um, I would say one of my biggest goals when we really started to realize that this was actually gonna happen, um, was I wanted to be able to know that my book was in the Library of Congress and that it was there and it could never be taken away. And so when I got my Library of Congress number, that was one of those moments where it was just, that solid moment where it became tangible.
That's awesome. Yeah, and it's certainly inspirational in that you had something that you wanted to do, and you found a way. Working with Grayson, and even writing the a good chunk of the book yourself to get to this point. So definitely props to you for sticking through it.
Thank
Um,
you.
you mentioned how in the end of the book there's a little bit of a little bio blurb. You mentioned playing role playing games, and now you just mentioned about being a DM. How have you found that that experience has influenced your writing? Like you said that you've been a DM for Dungeons and Dragons before. Has it helped you? Has it hurt you? Being a DM versus an author, um, it is a bit of a different style of storytelling.
It is. It is. When I originally had the idea for this story, I was attempting to find ways to tell it. So I actually was building it as part of a campaign setting, and I was selecting individuals, to possibly be some of the main players. But as you said, it's a different experience. They had their own take, they had their own visions, and they wanted to go this way or go that way. And it was kind of the same story, but it wasn't really the story. And being able to see that, but the advantage of being a DM is that I've gotten to be exposed to so many creative minds. They might not be storytellers to themselves, but telling those stories at the table through their actions, through their choices as characters, you get to see, 15 different ways that a character could face a problem in a book and be like, okay, well, the natural way would be choice A, but what if they did choice B? What if they, went that direction? What would that look like? What would the consequences of those decisions be? And being a DM and watching those and having to be the one who comes up with those consequences, it gives you a creative freedom where, I'm a meticulous plotter. That's what I learned about my writing process is I outline everything. I start with my acts and then I get down to my beats and then I get to my scenes. And in the scenes, I'll write down dialogue bullet points and, so and so character enters the room. Then they do this. And then I expand all of those into paragraphs, and that's how my process works. But inevitably, I'll get halfway through a scene, I'm like, "Well, but what if instead the character goes that way?" And, being able to adapt to that freedom, I think is what being a DM taught me the most, and it's probably the most used skill in our writing.
Indeed, yeah, and I liked how Grayson mentioned it in your blog, Sainan Books, that he's a little bit more of the crazy pantser in the in the co-authoring.
Mhm.
How is that working with? So you've mentioned that you're more of a plotter and he's more of a pantser or writing by the seat of your pants. How have you found that balance between what are, in my opinion, two very different ways of approaching writing a story?
Yeah, that was one of the I think probably the more challenging things that we did together was trying to figure out that balance between our styles. Um, but where we landed, and I think it's really interesting, is that I will give him a tent poles. I'll say, okay, we are going to start here and we're going to end here. The characters need to have and or know this, and by the end they need to have and or know that. I will leave you to figure out how that goes and how that pathway looks. And he will sit and he'll write 3 or 4 scenes or 4 or 5 chapters and take through that process, and you get to see little character glimpses and little, moments that, are truly his as they wind their way from point A to point B. And that, I think, was one of the most joys, like, book 1 was interesting because it was really supposed to be his story, but ironically, his vision of the story doesn't actually take place until book 2. So he felt a lot of times like he was writing a prequel to his story.
Hmm.
Um, and most of the foundation of book 1 was the ideas that I had brought to the table, which I will give is why he duped me into the writing process. Um, so we really caught our stride in writing book 2. It's a 4-part series, and all 4 manuscripts are complete. We have them stored away and are editing them right now. Um, but when we really hit our stride as co-authors in book 2, that was where I think the most fun and creative experience was happening. Because I would say, okay, here's point A, here's point B, take the characters for there, and he would write that whole pathway. And then I would read that and I would look at that and I'd be like, oh, that's so surprising, or that's an idea that I hadn't thought about. That inspires me to add this element to the scene that I was getting ready to work on. And then I would write it, and then he would look at that and go, oh, I hadn't even thought about that. And then he would write something new in the next scene that he was working on. And we just, that natural flow of discovering these little secrets, these little hidden gems I wouldn't have done because I would have never gotten writing until I got all those. He was forcing me to kind of find those with his more wandering style.
Hmm.
So yeah, I think it was really, like I said, they're 2 styles that shouldn't work together, and yet somehow we took the best of both and made them into this, gorgeous process that we were able to share.
That's awesome. Yeah, and it sounds like you really found a way to take those two styles and blend them together. The way that you just described that sounds like such a good combination of skills of of taking the plotter side of planning and structure and the the pantser side where it's like a little bit more of the chaotic and a little bit more of the figuring it out as you go. It's interesting that you mentioned around having the 4 manuscripts written. Um, So at what point would you say that you had the four manuscripts written? And I'll say, in my experience with other authors thus far, there seems to be, I guess, maybe something that's a little unique in this scenario is where they'll write a manuscript, they'll edit it, they'll publish it, and then start working on book two. But where you mentioned you have all four written already, which is amazing. How has that process been as having, all the story written out already as you're kind of publishing the books?
So I think we lucked into kind of the way it was because when we sat down to tell the story, we originally thought it was going to be a book. And when, I was like, okay, here's the part of the relationship between Simon and his father that I really want to explore and show and shape. And then here's the next thing about Simon's history that I want to show. And then, Grayson was like, okay, here's where I want to start here. And this is when Jesse meets, Caleb for the first time and how that relationship is going to form up and foundation. And as we started to kind of carve the beats up for what the whole story would look like, we realized, well, we don't have enough room in one book to tell all of those things. So we broke it into three. It was basically, okay, well, then we'll take our three-act story structure and we'll make each act a book. And then the middle got too big, so it became two books. And that's how it became the four-part series. So we really looked at it as one story. We didn't look at it as four different books. We just wrote through the story. And that's been, I think, probably the most challenging part of having it all written is now that when we're going into revision of book two, I can't look at it as just a continuation. I have to restart it as a book. I have to set the foundations. I have to give the original character descriptions. I have to go through all those things that you take for granted in the storytelling process. Um, from start to finish, we started writing Tale of 2019, and I would say that we had all four manuscripts roughed in and penned out in early of 2022. It took us about 18 to 24 months to write all four of them, um, especially once we got the wheels rolling. Um, and the editing process is taking about a year to a year and a half for each book because we're going through and we're again restructuring some of the story beats and making sure that they're more cohesive standalone stories, and we're adding foreshadowing elements to things that we now know are going to occur later in the story. So that revision process is intensive, I think is the best word.
Indeed, indeed, yeah, and it's hey, you mentioned the benefit I have seen of having uh having the story and then being able to see where you're going to end up is like you say you're going to be able to um tease certain parts, foreshadow, lean into certain elements. But that's also interesting on the flip side of how you say that it's also a challenge of you know the first book is out, that's the set first book. You can't really, well, you could, I mean, you could do revisions, but essentially that's the first book. It's also interesting that you mentioned that it was broken into parts because, from my personal experience anyway, I felt like it was a self-contained story that has like that potential for more, which I appreciate in first books. Because at this point you could say I enjoyed that story and walk away and be happy, where sometimes books will like leave it on such a cliffhanger that that it's almost like a painful experience.
Uh-huh.
But there's certainly elements of it's like where it's like, oh crud, I want to know what's going to happen with these characters when you get to the end. I don't want to go into spoiler territory, but yeah, I just thought it was cool that you were able to have it be, even though it's like started out as like a single concept that was broken into parts, that the first book is self-contained. Um, yeah, so I thought that was, I don't know if that is feedback that you've received thus far, but that's been my finding anyway.
No, no, I
Um,
appreciate that. Yeah, that was actually one of our intentions when we realized that we were going to be separating it into stories. Was we wanted each book to be standalone. We kind of the same way. Like I've read series where I get to the end of the first book and I'm like, you've left me in the middle of something. Now I have no choice but to progress. And I like giving, we like giving the reader that agency of like, okay, if you liked this, great. If you want to continue with us, we love to have you. But you don't feel obligated to come with us. We can give you this, and if that's what you needed, then you can walk away. We wanted that, like you said, that standalone. So we were very once we realized we had to split it, we focused in on each one and said, okay, what else does it need to become that self-contained bubble?
And you mentioned that this is kind of like your first real entry into writing as far as like novel based. Um, would you say that there's any other writings that you've done in the before this, or like this is like the real first uh, published work or first thing that the world is getting to enjoy that's from your writing and your experience?
It's the first one for me to get out there. Like I said, Grayson had tried his hand in, a couple fan fictions and some, various different specialty blogs, and he's really been a very creative writer. Just chipping away at little places for the better part of 20 years. We're actually going back and looking at one of his original stories that I remember reading when we first became friends in the late 90s, and seeing if we can take that and resurrect it and turn it into something, something new. Um, so he's got a little bit more kind of work floating out there. But for me, this was, other than a couple college papers that I'm sure, a professor or two still know, this for me was the first foray into the creative writing field where any of my work has really gotten a chance to see the light of day.
Hmm. And how have you found that experience? It's been something that it's been on your mind for quite some time. You now have the book out in the world. You have people reading it. Um, yeah, how have you found like the realities of publishing and self publishing um, compared to maybe the envisions of what you had thought it could be?
Yeah, our publication journey certainly took some twists and turns in the pathway. Again, because we originally looked at this as such a shared concept. We had actually at one point played with a pseudonym of Graham Clevenger, his legal last name and my last name kind of combined into a single author entity. And, as we started to get into the process, and I realized, well, if I can write, which he taught me that I could, I do have other stories that I'd like to finally go out and tackle. And he is a far more prolific writer than I am. He's already written, I think, 4 additional books into our series that I'm now responsible for editing. Um, Uh, so he's just churning ideas out. Um, and as we looked at that, we're like, well, if he's gonna have all his independent work and I want all my independent work, then it really doesn't make sense for us to share a pen name anymore. So we decided to take on our own identities and bring that to the table. And then once we did that, it was okay, well, then is self-publishing the route that we want to go? Because now who's taking the burden or the ownership of that? How's that credit going to work? Especially with a co-author situation, it was a little murky. And we threw out some queries. I think I probably queried 40 or 50 different agents, around the industry. And fantasy is one of those markets where there's hot spots and there's not hot spots. And we just didn't have a spot right now that they were searching for. And romantasy was kind of making its like surge towards the top. And we have romantic elements, but we're not romantasy. So, we were just in a space where we weren't gathering the attention that we wanted. And so it was like, okay, well, then, we should publish on our own. But how do you self-publish when there's 2 people? Well, I guess you accidentally build a book company. So we kind of built our publishing company out of necessity. So we founded Sainan Books. We put together all the information for it. And, now we're going to be able to put both my work and my work out. And objectively, the goal will be in another hopefully a few years, is to be able to now offer that handout to, um, other indie authors who can't, find a big five or, big traditional label, and be able to give them some self-publishing, or some small indie press publishing that I can pull them up and get them the recognition that they deserve.
Hmm. That's awesome. Yeah, and I feel like there definitely needs to be more of that. And it's kind of interesting how, you set out to write a book, you found someone to work with you to co-author. You're like, well, let's do the self-publishing, but then along the way, you kind of falling into this, well, let's just start a small publishing company and be that indie press. That's really cool. And I've noticed on social media you've talked about how you've been to several conferences over the last little bit, and yeah, I think you even have some more planned coming up here as well. How have you found that side of experience? So you've got the book out, you've got people who are enjoying it. Yeah, how have you found the conference side of marketing it and getting it out to more people?
Yeah, it's it was actually one of the things that I think motivated me a lot during the writing process is, I live in the Chicagoland area, Chicago, Illinois, and one of the biggest pop culture, science fiction, fantasy, gaming conventions, is C2E2, and it's held every year. And I would go there and I'd see the writers block, the authors alley, and there'd be 26 independent authors all talking about their books and selling their books, and and giving those spaces. And I really just thought that that was such a fascinating and amazing concept, to be able to have those moments where you you're not hunting for your target audience. You're in a space where your target audience exists, that they want to be there, and that they want to look for things to consume. They want those stories, they want those rich, places, and you happen to have that for them. And that a natural connection between, the reader and the writer, that doesn't require any, forced effort. And, I looked at that and I thought that would be really, really fascinating. Now, obviously, C2E2 is huge, and you got to kind of work your way into that space because we're not quite there yet. But we still have a lot of local conventions in the area that are all, gaming or science fiction and fantasy related. And those are the people who I know would enjoy the story. Um, and, we got to sit in a couple booths, and I got a few more coming up. And I don't think anything prepared me to like see somebody come up, fall in love with the story, walk away with a copy of the book in their hand, and then an hour later you walk by, you see them walking by, and they still have that book tucked underneath their arm. Um, and that joy of just being like, that happened because we made that happen. And so, being able to connect and have those moments and share that moment with a reader who, I know is going to be walking away with some satisfaction of that they've gotten that story. It's a really cool experience to have. And I'm a con rat. I love being at cons. So, as we get to get more steam and get more books and more marketing, that schedule is going to open up. Hopefully, as well as my kids will growing up and giving them more freedom. Giving me a little bit more spare time. But yeah, I love conventions. I think, again, it just comes back to I'm a sci-fi fantasy, lover. I've been in love with this genre for my entire life, and those are my people.
Hmm. That's awesome. And having read the book, you can definitely feel that coming through it. Um, I would say one of the things that also highlighted it to me is the appendix and how much how much detail you're putting in and how much effort you're putting in to build this world. That it actually kind of blew me away, the depth of the different races, the different characters, the different histories, the different magic systems. Like I felt like if, and it's funny you mentioned that you're a DM because it's like I felt like I could build a D&D campaign out of this, and it's like it's a full world that I could just live in. Yeah, you can definitely see that coming through the story. But I guess the question for you then is, building a fantasy world, you're inventing new things, you're bringing in some concepts that people would maybe understand. You have the appendix, which goes into details into certain concepts, but then you're also having to balance that with, introducing new systems. How did you find that balance between something that you want to write in the story to say, okay, we're going to explain how this functionally works, versus something that you're saving for appendix to be like, okay, maybe this is additional content that people could dive into?
Yeah, so I Grayson and I fell well, and this is actually a dividing point for us. I'll be clear on this. Um, he appreciates Robert Jordan and the Wheel of Time series. He understands that it's, a staple in the fantasy realm, just never something that he could get into. Where I have consumed that entire mythology to the core. um, but we both loved that classic feel, where you open the book and there's a world map right at the front, and then you get a little bit deeper and you've got the characters, and then you go back to the appendix and it's got the list of the characters and the places, and that rich, lore. If you want to dig deeper, it's all there. And we loved that classic feel. We also loved the chapter titles, which we thought had gone a long way away. These were elements of fantasy that we fell in love with as children, that we wanted to bring back to the table and showcase in our work. Um, but at the same time, while I loved Tolkien and I respect Jordan in that space, they could give you 7 pages on a blade of grass. Like, it was it was so lore intensive, and so, I'm gonna explain every single thing about this one word that you just heard about. Um, and, for that modern storytelling, it just kind of takes you out of the moment, and we wanted to kind of stay away from that. Um, so I really started to fall in love with the Night Angel trilogy by Brent Weeks. And, he had this kind of almost like shotgun approach of, well, here's this kingdom. And then you just keep reading mine. You're like, wait, you mentioned the kingdom, but you didn't tell me anything about it. And it's like, well, yeah, because it's like saying, hey, we're the United States. That's Canada. We know. Everybody here knows who Canada is. And, you don't have to explain that space. I think we have to explain it now in modern times, but that's for political stuff that I won't get into. But you have these characters. That's their world. They naturally should know who their neighbors are and what those things mean. So we wanted to stay in that reality of, if you mentioned something or you brought it up, it was casual in conversation. But we wanted to stay away from the maid butler explanation, whereas like both of those people should know the thing that they're talking about. So why are they talking about it at the level that they're talking about it? So what we did is we looked for sneaky ways to slide it in. Where it's like, okay, we have this event called the Devastation, where the starships fell from the sky and created some of the landmarks that are in our story. So how do we explain that? Well, one of our main characters is a student, so let's see him learning that lesson or observing that lesson in the classroom. It gives you a natural reason why it's being explained. So if we could find a good way to give that dump without making it feel like an info dump, we would navigate it in the story. Everything else, we just had to be patient and be like, okay, that can be put off, or we can explain that in another place. And there's a lot of additional lore that will be exposed in book 2 and book 3. And I think patience as a fantasy author is one of those things that you have to learn. It's like, I want to tell you everything about my world, but maybe not at this time.
That's totally fair, and yeah, that's definitely a challenge because, you've lived with these stories in your head for so long that you want people to experience it, you want them to know about it. But I feel like you did a really good job, and both you and Grayson, in that you found a good balance. I found anyway, between giving people information about a thing that doesn't exist in the real world, so people know what you're talking about, but while not also being too laborsome of, oh my gosh, I got to get through a page of explaining one simple concept. Yeah, I thought you found the balance there well, but definitely I can appreciate how challenging that would be to to balance how much information do we put in, and yeah, when do we explain certain concepts.
Yeah, we found a certain beauty in world building through contrast, where the way to show that depth, the way to show that richness is to, give you something here and give you a very specific way that that works and the way that it's explored, and then show you this instead. And when you see that, this becomes more. You get little glimpses of it in book one, but it'll become more rich in book two, where Heiston, which is kind of the central setting of our story, is a very cosmopolitan, big city type environment. There's lots of cultures and lots of people and various different things. So when the boys take a small trip out to like wine country, and you can see like the simplistic farming town, it's like, oh, that's right. That's, it makes that metro feel more grown. And we're going to be exploring a much older civilization in book two. And yeah, my wife talks about the experience that she had when she was in London, and you realize that you're sitting on a park bench that's older than the entire country that you came from, and how that history is felt in the bones of London and some of the, those older cities. And we wanted to be able to show, okay, when you're in this, older civilization, you get to see how more traditional and slow paced they are versus the speed and chaos that is the big city.
I think you did well in this book, and it's certainly setting up the future books in such a way that it's like I want to know more. So I think that you found a good balance of explaining, so I understand what you're talking about, but then leaving some things unexplained, so that it's like there's a curiosity element. One of the things I thought was pretty cool about your universe was the magic system and how there's different kinds of magic systems. Um, what would you say is the way that you came about with this is how we want to do magic in this story?
Yeah, the magic system, we started with, actually we started down to the roots. We started with D&D, and we really looked at like what is the difference between, a wizard and a sorcerer, and why do they function differently? And, so we started to explain kind of how that was. In addition to being a sci-fi fantasy nerd, I also studied philosophy in college, and I fell in love with Aristotle and Plato's concept of the ideals. That somewhere in the meta realm is this existence of the tree, the perfect tree, and that all of the things that we experience as trees are just imperfect copies of what that tree would be. And so I kind of brought that metaphysical theory into our magic system. So if you're gifted in fire, you understand core what fire is and what it can do and what it obeys. And that gives you the ability to reach through, into the veil that we have in our book, and bring that arcane energy in and manipulate it to create versions of fire that can do what you need to do. And wizards have kind of bypassed that and have basically learned all the mathematical formulas to replicate that same effect. And so you have the contrast between the super structured, these are the rules, this is how it has to happen magic, versus the gifted, which are more creative and more thought process. And then it became kind of the contrast between like a professional chef who's went to culinary school and knows everything that you need to do and all the formulas, versus somebody who can just walk into a kitchen and pick up a couple ingredients and make magic happen. And so that was kind of the way that that magic system took shape for us.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I appreciated several times throughout the story how you had characters from those different groups and how they would interact with each other, and how they either have some animosity even towards other groups based on the kinds of magic that they use or how they bring that magic about. I thought that was really a really cool representation of how a magic system could exist, and hearing how you're describing it, that makes a lot more sense of how you came about to that system.
Yeah. Yeah, we were excited about it, and, again, those unintended consequences, which I got from, from Grayson is, okay, well, if you have structured magic and approved magic, then that implies that there is disapproved magic, and now you have black markets and and being able to walk down some of those rabbit holes.
That's awesome. And I guess in in some ways, uh, both you and Grayson are that kind of author of the writing is your magic, and having two different approaches of coming at the same concept, but how you're doing it is slightly different. But in the end, you're able to produce something that that is pretty interesting to experience. So I don't know if that was intentional or unintentional of a parallel there, but
No, that's the first I've heard about that, but thank you very much. That's yeah, I love that. We laugh at the unintentional consequence of our main characters because you have Simon who's, very rigid, rule following and every day like this is my life and this is what I do and he ends up becoming a gifted sorcerer and having to figure out how to instinctively use magic versus you have Jesse who's that street rat thief who's used to breaking rules but as a structured magic, person. So that little invert we found was it was kind of a happy accident, happy coincidence. But the fact that comparative to Grayson and I's approach on writing is a really fun take. I appreciate that.
indeed, indeed. Yeah, and I was looking on socials, and if it's still hush hush, feel free to save it for a later announcement. But I saw that you mentioned that you're working on a film of some sort or filming of some sort. Can you talk about that yet, or is it still behind the scenes and not ready to announce?
It was actually the filming of your podcast. I was very excited.
Oh, very fair enough. That's awesome. Well, yeah, like I said, it's a pleasure to have you because we've talked for a bit now on socials, and I've been seeing how your story is progressing. Yeah, I guess is there anything that you want to talk about on the podcast? Anything that you feel like people would find interesting about you personally or about your book?
Um, I think learning the publishing process and building a community through socials with all these surrounding authors, I think is probably the thing that I was not expecting coming into the process. I've really fallen in love with, I guess, kind of taking the climb that I've already made and then helping others who are struggling to make that same climb. I didn't expect that I would succeed, let alone have advice that seems to have been helpful to others. And so, being able to, like you said, meet people like yourself on socials and, meeting all these talented authors and artists and just kind of seeing but, not only sharing my success, but sharing, some of my failures and missteps and mistakes. Those types of things that I can help others learn from. I know you and I have talked about it, and it's not something that I talk a lot about, but we kind of got over anxious and kind of pressed with deadlines, and we made some choices with our original cover that didn't quite pan out the way that we wanted them to, and it's to a small indie author, it's a $600 cover. It's that's a costly mistake in the process. But now, I get to be able to talk to other authors and say, if you're feeling like you're getting into a place or if you're hearing red flags or seeing red flags, take the time to listen to those because if you don't, it can come back and kind of push you in a direction that you didn't want to go. And luckily I was privileged enough to put us in a position where I could go and rectify that mistake and redo our cover and relaunch the book and kind of get into a new space where our original vision, which is where I wanted to be a year ago, is now what's truly out there on page. So, I think, that's the thing that I like to do the most in my author's journey is to help not only again share successes, but share those missteps and say, okay, this is something that, if you're getting ready to do this, don't buy this ISBN, buy 10 because you're going to need them. Trust me.
Being able to take what you've learned both from the success side and the failure side, and being able to turn that into something to teach other people, that's a really cool thing to do. And not everyone would do it. Not everyone would, even be willing to talk about that they failed at all. So definitely props to you for being open about, what you've experienced, and then taking that experience to help other authors. I feel like the industry could use a lot more people like you. So keep doing that. I'm really excited to see, where Sainan Books goes. And talking about the cover, I thought that was like it added an extra value of cool, in my opinion, of learning that you actually drew the cover for the redesigned cover, which actually also has an optical illusion of a sort, which I thought was another added layer of pretty awesome. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, so do you have an artistic background that you're bringing this out, or yeah?
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, I've always been to somebody who was able to sketch. I did go to school for graphic arts at one point. And again, it's kind of the same pathway that the author's journey took for me. Like I fell in love with art. I used to draw as a child all the time. I took a couple graphic arts courses and then life got in the way and I just watched that dream kind of get shoved away to the side and never really picked back up. And when we first started the book, I started to try to play around with some covers. Actually, I think I still have one of my original mock-ups because speaking of, sometimes you have to go through failure to get to success. It's kind of this you know back when it was still called Manicore Shadow before we changed the book to The War of Night. They were there. There were little elements where I'm like, I'm almost where we wanted. But we again fell in love with covers and artists and authors out there like James Islington and the Night Angel trilogy from Brent Weeks and even the Crescent City from Sarah J. Maas, the that stark white and red cover with the little gold accents, like just ones that I remember every time I'd walk into a bookstore, like my eyes immediately locked onto that cover and I went, what's that? Where the negative space of the white kind of brings you to that cover. And that's what we always wanted. That was our original vision for the cover, and we didn't quite land there, but when we had the ability to, like you said, kind of redesign this cover and sit down and think, okay, let's go. That's what I wanted to shoot for. And I remember I was driving home one night and the optical illusion, the vision of I think it's the classic one where it's the face with the vase in the center. Where are you looking at a vase or are you looking at two people? Um, that hit me like a just ton of bricks on the way home one night, and I went, I wonder if I can do something with that. And so I sat down and I had the idea of the manicore wings reaching out and the faces, cutting to there, and it was one of the first times in a very long time where I put pen to paper and what was on the paper was actually better than what was in my head. Because normally I write about half of an art piece and then I rip it up in frustration and move on with my life. Um, this was one of those ones where the inspiration hit and the result was exactly what I wanted. It was, so much crisper. My only regret is that I'm not a good enough digital artist to be able to do that like with vectors. So I had to like really make sure that the lines were tight so that my scans came in properly, and making sure that the resolution held. to a printable degree. But once I got through it and I was able to get it properly digitized, um, seeing the final cover when I finally got the Canva Pro all the way now. Got the layout and put it together, and it was like that's where our book was. That's where I wanted us to be from the get go. And there's another post out there on my socials that talks about the spine design, right? Because with book two, we're going to have the orange back and the yellow front, and we wanted that pride flag to be visible across all of the spines of our series, because the that representation, that queer normative world, is something that we wanted to promote and not hide of our books. We didn't want to be like, oh well, they're representative just because. No, we are representative because it's our values. Grayson's, he's a gay man living in the unfortunate southern part of the United States. I'm trying to get him to move up here to a more accepting community. But
Hmm.
you know, that's part of our relationship, is that friendship between a hetero person and a gay person, and being able to show the world that this is just normal. This is just how we are. We don't have to hide it. We don't have to explain it. It's just who we are, and it's who our characters will be, and it's the world you kind of, as a fantasy writer, you craft the world you want to live in. That's the world I want.
That's super cool. And also, I noticed in your logo for Sainan Books also has, I believe, the pride flag in it. Yeah, what have you found as being co-authors, having the queer representation in your books, having the pride flag in your logo, having the spines eventually building out to being a pride flag? Yeah, how have you found that as an author trying to get your book out to more people and the reception that you've been getting?
I think it's we knew what the space was that we were entering. And that, I will actually say, is probably one of the best things about the fantasy, science fiction, and kind of speculative fiction community is, most of us, especially, in the kind of mid 40s, space, we grew up in the United States in times where this panic, this negative rhetoric, it's not new. I've been hearing anti-LGBTQ rhetoric since I was in school in the 90s, and that. So you just kind of put the noise in the background, and you just stand on your principles. And I'm never going to shy away from the fact that my friends and family and some of the best people in my life are LGBTQ, and I shouldn't have to explain that that relationship is important to me. They are my people, they are my family. And so, I just put that noise in the background, and I focus on who we are and what our stories are and what those, spaces are. And, for those of us that grew up in that realm, fantasy, science fiction, tabletop role playing games, we were the misfits. We were the outcasts. We were the ones who were put down and looked upon. And so when we tell our story about acceptance, and we tell our story about normalizing, diverse backgrounds and diverse people and diverse relationships, they're accepting of that. They want that. That's, we've all been that. Now, you still have some toxic folk, and I'm always going to get some negative noise, but I just don't pay attention to it. I like to focus on positivity and staying in a positive zone. Um, and I'm upfront about it. I've said I'm a father, I'm a son, I have strong LGBTQ connections. I'm not afraid to drop an F bomb here or there. That's the voice that told this story. If you are with it, great. If you're not, there's 100 other stories out there for you.
If people wanted to connect with you, either to learn more about Sainan Books and that angle, or to learn more about your book, where would be the best place for people to find you on the internet?
So sinanbooks.com is our home base. That's our website. It's got our blog. It's got information about our books. It's got all of our social media. It's kind of our center point. Grayson and I have had the pleasure of being able to put together our blog for the better part of our writing process. Probably a good, I'd say, 3 years or so of it have been covered. We talk about our experiences in LGBTQ relationships, our experience in mental health, our experience through the writing process and the author's journey and publication, and a broad array of topics about how we built this together. Over the course of the 5 years that we've put into it. You can always find me on social media as I'm at Sainan Books on pretty much every like, I'm big on Threads. I love Threads. Threads is, out of all the social media platforms, I think that is my most comfort spot. I've gotten the most engagement, and I've found so many wonderful people through that platform, including yourself, where that's just one of my safe spaces. Instagram. I'm trying to get a little bit better on Instagram. I'm not as photogenic as I would like to be, so I shy away from it. I'm starting to put together a TikTok, but I'm not very good at TikTok. Um, but yeah, I think signedbooks.com is kind of our center space. That's our home base. And you can learn everything you need to know about us right there.
That's awesome. And for people who have read the book, what would you say is the next thing to look forward to? So you've got book two in the works, and do you have a rough target of when you're trying to get that launched?
Yeah, we're about 50% of the way through revisions on Old Bones, Old Ways, which is the second book. And that title and the catchphrase have a little special meaning to me. So Old Bones, Old Ways, we're about halfway through the revisions. We're hoping to get that into the hands of beta, probably early summer. And then if we can keep on track, I'd like to try to get that publication date right about November again. We really like that about every year span between the two. Otherwise, it'll be very, very early of 2026.
Awesome. Well, again, thanks for taking some time out of your day to tell us about your book. And yeah, I wish you all the best. And I'll put links to, the things you mentioned and a few things you didn't for people to connect with you and to learn more about your books. But yeah, I just appreciate you taking some time out of your day to talk about your stories.
I appreciate you having me. Like I said, I've it's been a wild ride. It's certainly just beginning, and I love having opportunities to take moments like this with, big indie supporters. I want to say a thank you to what you've been doing in the indie community. You're raising these voices who need that platform. They deserve that platform to get their voices heard. And watching how you put all your energy into supporting them and rising them up, that's a gift that I think you should be very proud of, because that's a selfless. Again, we need people like that in the community that not only look for themselves, but they look to rise everyone else with them, and I really appreciate that.
Indeed, yeah, it's my pleasure. Um, as an author and a writer myself, it's it's really weighed on my heart to see so many people struggling to get their books out there to find readers, even just to write the book. I've talked to a number of writers who want to write their stories, but for some reason or another, they just can't quite get there. So, I want, in a similar vein to how you've said you've learned some things you want to teach other people. I want to do the same. I feel like there's so many stories out there that haven't been told or haven't reached people for one reason or another, and there's things that I can do to help people to get to that end result. So I appreciate that, and likewise, I'm happy to have a fellow person of supporting other authors, because there's a lot of work to go around. So the more the merrier. Yeah, so if you're an author, or if you're an aspiring author, definitely reach out. There are people who want to help you along, and here's one of them. So connect with them, find him on socials, check out his website, and read his book too, because it's it's also really good. Yeah, and hope everyone has a good rest of your day.